Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month, believe it or not, we're exploring Zionism. This series was sponsored by our friends at Unpacked. To learn more about the incredible podcast, including their new series, Unpacking Israeli History, hosted by our guest today, Dr. Noam Weissman, check out JewishUnpack.com or wherever your local podcasts are sold. And if you're interested in sponsoring a future series or episode, be sure to reach out to 1840.org. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. It is hard to describe the type of Zionism that I grew up with. It is not really a term that I heard my parents or grandparents use a great deal. It was not something that I really heard them display like we are now involved in being Zionists. I went to an elementary school known as South Shore, some call it Yeshivas Torah's Chaim. I can't even put it into words what exactly their relationship was to the notion of Zionism. It was the kind of place where we did not march in the Israeli Day Parade. We did not say any special prayers like a Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, though I remember in some years the head of the school was Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky. He is the son, the oldest son, Olav Shalom, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky is the oldest son of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Torah V'das, one of the real leaders, the Gedolei Hador, the leaders of the generation of the Jewish people. His younger brother, Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky, is the Rosh Yeshiva in Philly and is obviously a storied personality and one of the older Rosh Yeshiva, if not the oldest Rosh Yeshiva in America today. His older brother, Reb Binyamin, who happened to have been a very close friend of our families and the Kamenetskys intersect in 1,001 ways. For those who are really in the know, we almost call them relatives. That's probably because of our fictional relationship with Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky's son, Rav Mati Kamenetsky, Rav Mordechai Kamenetsky. The original ties are really with my grandfather and Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky, who went to Torah V'das together in those early years. We have pictures of them together, and they would always, at any South Shore elementary school event, they would always catch up and reminisce, and it was a big source of pride for myself that my grandfather kind of knew the head of the school, the Rosh Yeshiva of the elementary school. But growing up, I don't have a lot of memories about Yom HaAtzmaut and about the formal expressions of Zionism. I have one memory of Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky telling the Menahel, that's like the principal, Rav Chanina Hertzberg, after davening, Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky went up and said, we're going to say Tehillim. After davening, it was on Yom HaAtzmaut. He didn't say we're going to say Hallel. He said we're going to say Tehillim, Psalms. And the chapters in Psalms that we said corresponded to the ones that we normally say during Hallel. They didn't tell us that. They just said we're going to say some Tehillim now. And I don't know if there was maybe differences of opinion of what should be done. I remember Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky, who was kind of like the head of school, the Rosh Yeshiva elementary school, was the one who made the announcement. It was not the principal, Rav Chanina Hertzberg. But I remember there was always like a dance about what exactly am I? Even reflecting on myself. Am I, a proper Zionist? I was never really sure how to characterize myself, because in America, at least growing up in America, the way that you express Zionism is with these certain rituals that I don't think fully capture one's relationship, not just to Israel, but as I always try to call it, Eretz Yisrael, which is much older. It didn't begin in 1948. It began with God's promise to Avraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, to leave your land and go to the land, El ha'aretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. It's the fulfillment of a lifelong promise and a lifelong yearning that transcends any individual government or any individual person. And that's kind of the world that I grew up in. It seemed to be much larger than the expressions that we had in America. Blue and white cookies, marching in the parade. Do you say Hallel? Do you not say Hallel? Do you make a bracha? Do you not make a bracha? All of those discussions, as important as they are, to me felt very temporal. They felt very, I don't want to use the word political, but they felt very of the moment and not stretching into history, which is for me what really evokes the soulfulness that I have towards Eretz Yisrael, towards the land of Israel, towards the Medina of Eretz Yisrael. Israel, the government that we have in Israel, I always wanted to feel that anchor in something that was more transcendent. And I guess, I don't know, blue and white cookies, blue and white donuts, which I think the school did serve some years, never fully captured it. And I first marched in the Israeli Day Parade. I don't know why it's scheduled when it is. The parade is never on Yom Ha'atzmaut, to my recollection. I don't know when it is or why it is, but the first time I ever marched, I was actually in 9th grade in high school. My memories of that are really just my Rabbeim and the question of, is Rebbe going to put on the Israeli Day t-shirt above his white shirt or going to take off the white shirt and just wear a t-shirt? You can really tell a lot from the different styles of Rabbeim, of teachers in modern Orthodox high schools, based on how they negotiate their classic white shirt and tie and their special Yom Ha'atzmaut t-shirt. Does the t-shirt go on top, like many? Or, in later years, the Menahel of my high school, Rav Yisrael Kamenetsky, I believe, has gone on the full t-shirt bandwagon. No white shirt underneath, which I believe is how he began, and just wears a t-shirt during the parade, though I know different Rabbeim, at least in the high school I go to, negotiate with that question differently. But all of these questions, Yom Ha'atzmaut t-shirts, blue and white cookies, even whether or not you have a flag inside of the sanctuary of your shul, is the flag on the outside, do you not have a flag altogether? None of these fully captured, and I guess were almost lost on me growing up. They never felt to capture the enormity of what the state of Israel was really all about. And I remember feeling that misalignment almost in my own life when I was having a conversation. I had mentioned her once. I have a sister, Ilana, who lives in Israel. At the time, I believe I had 2 sisters. And I remember talking to her husband, who's, was learning in Kollel, who's part of the Haredi community in Israel. And I remember talking to him about Zionism during my year in Israel when I was studying in Shalhevet. And I think in my youthful zeal, I don't know what it was, I was lecturing him, how can you not be, a Zionist in all of these ways? And I remember midway through the conversation, I was like, wow, what a fascinating dialogue we are having right now. David Beshefkin, 19 years old, 18 years old, lives in America, spending, 1 year in Israel lecturing my brother-in-law who has decided to raise a family in Israel. And I just realized, have I been sucked into Zionism as kind of this performative expression of the check boxes that you have of what does and does not make a Zionist? Or is this something much more transcendent that generations of Amcha Yisrael, of the Jewish people, were longing for and were yearning for? It's an analogy that a friend of mine, Ellie Steinberg, who lives in Lakewood, we were one time talking maybe over Twitter or maybe on the phone, I don't fully remember, and he said that a lot of times questions about whether or not you are a full Zionist or what makes somebody a full Zionist reminds him of a Seinfeld episode where Kramer is urged to wear a ribbon while marching in some fundraiser walk, in some marathon walk. Everybody needs to wear a ribbon. I think in the episode it was an AIDS march and everybody needed to wear the specific ribbon, and there's just putting a lot of pressure. You need to wear the ribbon. That's the only way that you can participate in this enterprise. And
you must wear the ribbon.
What you are? You're a ribbon bully.
Hey, you, come back here. Come back here and put this on.
Who do you think you are?
Put the ribbon on.
Hey, Cedric, Bob, this guy won't wear a ribbon.
Who? Who doesn't want to wear the ribbon? So, what's it going to be? Are you going to wear the ribbon? No, never. But I'm wearing the ribbon. He's wearing the ribbon. We are all wearing the ribbon. So why aren't you going to wear the ribbon?
This is America. I don't have to wear anything I don't want to wear.
What are we going to do with him?
I guess we're just going to have to teach him to wear the ribbon.
He was lamenting to me that a lot of times conversations about what Zionism means seems to be conversations that devolve into who does and does not wear the ribbon, and whatever that ribbon may or may not be, whether it's blue and white cookies, whether it's where you display the flag, or even, what you do on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Are you saying Hallel with a bracha and without a bracha? And those become the ribbons, so to speak, that you must wear if you want to participate in the marathon of Zionism. I don't know who it was or what I was reading. I like to think that I was reading the writings of Gershom Scholem, the academic, mystic, Kabbalist, and his relationship to Zionism, which evolved over the course of his life. But at some point, I think my relationship with Zionism, though it's a word that doesn't have that familial closeness with me personally, it feels very political. But my relationship with Eretz Yisrael, with Medinas Yisrael, is something that I've begun to start thinking about a lot more in a lot more serious way, because in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, I've seen the pushback against Israel, against the state of Israel, even from within the Jewish community, and it can be extraordinarily painful, and I am very often left without words because my foundational relationship to Israel was never formed through politics. It wasn't formed through op-eds and articles in newspapers. My relationship to Israel begins with the Siddur. It begins with davening, that we should see before our eyes the return to Zion with mercy, through mercy. It's the prayers every day that I have uttered, that my ancestors and generations of Jews have uttered, that we should be able to see a return to Zion, a full return, a full embodiment in Israel, and that we're beginning to see that in our lifetime. To not recognize it, to not be moved by it, I feel it is a disservice. It is a cruel disservice to generations who had yearned to see even a glimmer, a sliver of what we have now in Israel. It would be the cruelest lack of gratitude to not even pause for a moment and appreciate what we have. And I think there was one article that was extraordinarily controversial when it came out that actually gave me a new lens, an inverted lens, to appreciate what we have with the state of Israel. And that was an article that was published in the summer of 1976 in volume 16, the first issue of Tradition. It was published by Gary Epstein. You may know his son, Dr. Benji Epstein, who is absolutely wonderful. He's a psychologist, a close friend of mine, and hopefully we'll have him on here one of these days. But he wrote this article which caused, when I say an article caused an uproar, I mean legitimately an uproar. It is the only article that has ever been published in Tradition, to my knowledge, that starts with a disclaimer from the editors of Tradition, where they write, although the editors of Tradition regard the state of Israel as a pivotal instrumentality for the survival of Judaism in the modern world, they deem it important to open the pages of this journal for the discussion of controversial positions. Professor Epstein is a member of the Department of English at the University of Iowa. There's a disclaimer from the editors before the article. I've never seen this before. And the article asks a basic question: could Judaism survive Israel? And it has us contemplate, Chalila v'chas, chas v'shalom, God forbid. The article does have us contemplate what would happen if we saw in our lifetime the collapse of the state of Israel. And the letters to the editor were outraged that somebody would even present this as a possibility. The article itself argues that Judaism would survive, but even the possibility was seen to be so disgusting to put on the pages. How could we even contemplate such a thing? Here's one letter from the editor, a more tasteless article than the one by Gary Epstein on his self-serving proposition that Judaism can survive the fall of Israel. I have not read in a long time. If you cannot print this letter in your magazine, please forward it to Professor Epstein. There is another letter that came out which paraphrases the Rebbe of Kusk, where he says much of this article should not have been thought about, more of it not spoken about it, and most of it not put into printed form. This is not something that we should be thinking about. And I'm going to be honest, as controversial as this article is, I do think about this a lot. Because for me, while I grew up in a generation that almost took the state of Israel for granted, I do sometimes think that the inverted lens of thinking, God forbid, what would it mean for Yiddishkeit in our lifetime if we lost it? Would it be like Tisha B'Av? Would it be like mourning the fall of the first and second temple? How would we relate to that absence in our lives? And more, it seems like this generation who grew up within a world that takes the state of Israel for granted. And I'm not talking about not showing appreciation. Of course, to be a Jew is to show appreciation for the state of Israel. When I say take it for granted, it's unimaginable for us what Yiddishkeit would look like without a state of Israel. What would continue? What would not continue? What would happen next? It is a question that is hard to think about, but I think in many ways helps us appreciate appreciate what we actually have. As I've written about before on 1840 in relation to halacha, I think I grew up in a home where my father saw generations of Jewish children grow up and lose their connection to halacha. And his ability to see a generation lose their connection to something gave him a better appreciation for what he actually has and possesses. And in a similar way, I think very often reflecting on Eretz Yisrael, reflecting on the state of Israel, and not just, showing appreciation for all the amazing contributions that it's had, which I don't mean to say in a voice that's like, okay, we've been there, done that, we've heard that already. But I think taking a new glance and really learning to dig deep within the collective souls of Amcha Yisrael, of the Jewish people, and realize what we have and how it is a fulfillment of what so many generations had been yearning for, of what so many generations had been davening for. And to not be able to see even a sliver of that, to not be able to imagine of what Yiddishkeit would feel like, what Yiddishkeit would be like without the state of Israel, and the way that it protects Amcha Yisrael, and the way that it uplifts Amcha Yisrael and the Jewish people, is a lens that I constantly am reflecting on and thinking about. And that's why I think it's so important right now, even though there's so many political upheavals taking place in Israel. And we had planned this series before a lot of the upheavals were happening. Some of it we'll discuss, some of it we won't discuss. I never look at 1840 as commentary on breaking news. You can go to newspapers for that. You can go to your local Jewish leaders for that. I really try to think of 1840 as unpacking some of the foundational issues that will endure regardless of the headlines, regardless of what the contemporary crisis that's unfolding, and try to unpack something that is far more transcendent and far more enduring, though of course not to minimize in any ways the importance of contemporary politics and being involved in supporting and contending and reflecting and negotiating with all of the developments that take place in the state of Israel. And to begin with this, I wanted to talk about how we educate our children about Israel. There is a lot of pushback, particularly in contemporary times, about kind of the sanitized version of Zionism, that schools that do give a Zionist education, how should they be doing it? Should it be sanitized? Should it just be through the siddur? That's how I was raised, and in many ways still hold on to that as the form of education. And in order to have that discussion, I could think of nobody better than Dr. Noam Weissman. Aside from being an old and dear friend, he is the executive vice president of OpenDor Media. OpenDor Media is an incredible organization. I'm not just saying that because they're sponsoring this series, though Lord knows I am saying it also because they're sponsoring this series, but I do listen to a lot of their incredible podcasts, Jewish History Unpacked, Unpacking the Israel Story, which is hosted by Dr. Noam Weissman. And our conversation today, which in so many ways intersects with the questions of 1840, is how do we provide Israel education in the contemporary world? What is the landscape? How should we do it? And how can we further uplift and inspire our enduring connection? The connection, not of any one generation, but the connection of V'sechazenu einenu b'shuvcha l'tzion berachamim, that we should see with our eyes the full and complete return of Amcha Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael with mercy, with peace, with kindness. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Dr. Noam Weissman. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce someone who I know for many, many years. I consider him a friend. I am so excited to share with you our conversation with Noam Weissman. Welcome, Noam.
David, I consider you a friend as well. I'm so happy to be here and an avid listener of your podcast. So thank you so much for having me.
That means a great deal to me. What I want to talk about is you have spent a career and run an incredible enterprise that is dedicated to Israel education called Unpacked. And I want to, and you'll kill me for this pun, I want to unpack exactly what you and Unpacked are doing, which is, what problem is Israel education coming to solve? And I want to begin with the question of kind of noting that I am not your target demographic. My relationship to Israel was formed in kind of like the old-fashioned way. I went to almost like a non-Zionist, God forbid not an anti-Zionist, like a non-Zionist school where my relationship to Israel was founded through the siddur. It was founded through the fact that I have family members who live in Israel. That was a place that I visited, the Holy holy sites, the Kotel, Tzvat, the people who are buried there, the lives that are there. It's very familial. It is not political. And Unpack is very political in the way that they try to unpack the nature of Israel education. Who is the demographic that you are trying to reach? And what problem are you trying to solve?
I think that the way you framed that in terms of you going to a non-Zionist school, I want to start there because I think that that's in some ways the most interesting element. There's probably one theological interpretation of the events of 1948 that I don't understand very well, and that's non-Zionism. And so I find that particularly fascinating. I understand anti-Zionism in a profound way.
I do understand anti-Zionism in a profound theological way. And I understand Zionism.
Right.
Let me clarify what I mean by non-Zionism.
Okay.
You know, it was in elementary school. We didn't march in the Israeli Day Parade.
Okay.
We didn't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut in the traditional way. Maybe some years there were blue and white donuts. Maybe some years there were not. But I would say it was non-political Zionist.
Okay.
So when there was, God forbid, something going on in Eretz Yisrael, there was a terrorist attack or something happened, we would get together and we would say Tehillim. And I said the lens towards Israel, the foundation, was through the Siddur. And I grew up in a home where we're always talking about Israel, but it wasn't a polemical relationship where we were trying to justify and understand the very nature of the state of Israel's existence. And a lot of your content is doing exactly that.
Yeah.
So I understand why my educational upbringing, for me in particular, worked very well, because no political development is going to kind of sever my very familial, visceral ties to Israel. And my question is, it's really a question on Israel education in general. Are you trying to convince an anti-Zionist why you should be a Zionist? Are you trying to reach somebody and build that familial connection to Israel? Are you trying to give people educational information for when they get into debates on campus? Who is the demographic that Israel education, almost in general, I'm not talking about Unpacked in particular, is trying to reach? Like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve?
Israel education became a field, and this is so interesting, 10 to 15 years ago. It didn't really exist. It was kind of, there was Jewish education where people would work on Tanakh or perhaps Gemara, Talmud education, but there wasn't really a place for Israel education. And so 10 to 15 years ago, there was a field that developed. And the goal of the field was to say there are three basically different approaches to teaching about Israel. One is what you were describing, and I couldn't help but smile and smirk the whole time. The blue and white donuts, the Israel parade, the falafel, the cherry tomatoes, the ways, the startup.
Let's call it modern Orthodox American Yom HaAtzmaut education.
So that's
It works. It works for a lot of people. It actually was not my education,
Right.
but for some people, that's their connection.
Right. I don't know if we're going to come back to this, but I want to challenge whether or not it works and what it's working to accomplish.
Okay, but let's hear all three and then we'll discuss.
So what I was just describing is what's called Israel advocacy. And that is part of Israel lowercase e education. I'll explain why in a second, why I say lowercase e.
And why is that called Israel advocacy? It seems like the most parav, the most neutral, just like we love Israel, we march, we have the blue
Right.
and white donuts. Is that really called Israel advocacy?
Yeah, it's part of the Israel advocacy world where Israel advocacy is basically divided itself into Israel branding, which is really what that is, and Israel advocacy, which is to take the issues, whatever they are, and to prove something, to have a lens of advocacy, to have a lens of indoctrination in some ways, which is to accept what is being taught in a somewhat uncritical sort of way. To say, I have the truth, and I'm here to make sure that you emerge out of whatever intervention, call it school, call it youth group, call it trip, that you emerge with one specific takeaway. And I'm speaking about it in I hope, a polite way and a dispassionate way on purpose, because I wanted to first describe it.
Meaning when you say, I want to clarify, because this helps,
Yeah.
when you say Israel advocacy, you don't necessarily mean that it's training them to be advocates politically, but it's advocating a specific point of view.
Exactly. Precisely. It's saying, I have the truth about something or I have the beauty of something, and it's my job to pass this on to you.
To advocate for one specific idea. That makes a lot of sense to me now.
Yeah, so that's the world of Israel advocacy. And for years, when schools would say they're doing Israel education, what they meant was they were doing Israel advocacy.
And that's option one,
That's
right?
option one. And that's pretty typical in the modern Orthodox world. Maybe in a minute, you'll tell me when I could get into what I think is a little bit lacking in that approach.
Sure.
That's number one. I want to describe it first. Number two is what's called Israel studies. The goal of Israel studies is to basically say, I have a dispassionate view on what's going on here. My goal is not to solve a specific problem for you to have a training, kind of like Israel advocacy is about training, but to dispassionately develop knowledge about Israeli society, about Israeli history, about Israeli politics, to look at primary sources and to come out, whatever it means. There's no affective, emotional goals. And really, that's the way that hopefully some universities are engaging in Israel, but often, obviously, we know that's not the case, where it's more antagonistic towards Israel. But it's a different approach to learning about Israel, which is to study Israel in a dispassionate way, where I have the facts, I have the history.
Okay.
And then there's a third approach, what I call Israel education, capital E, bolded E, underline E. And that's when the goal is not to train and the goal is not to dispassionately develop, but the goal is to cultivate one's Jewish identity with Israel as part of that. And the reason that that is such a helpful way, what I find educationally, to engage young people in their learning about Israel, studying about Israel, is because what it does is it helps them ensure that they are not being defensive, that they're not here to just have one way to view something, but that they really utilize, I guess, like what I would call the IKEA effect, where they're building something, where they're cultivating something, and they're not there to prove something, they're there to understand something and have it form their identity, but without needing to have one prescribed way to view it. That's education as opposed to, let's say, indoctrination or inoculation, which is to give a little bit of the problem and then to serve as that antidote. So that's the capital E, Israel education.
So I'm so fascinated. I love the way that you kind of laid out these three approaches. I think the thing that I struggle with the most is the real difference between 1 and 3. The real difference between Israel advocacy, which we're kind of advocating for a particular point of view, and Israel education. I'm trying to understand, is the difference about kind of the tone and the tenor, that the first one has this more hasbara intensity where it's like Israel or bust and you got to be with Israel on anything, maybe, I don't know who you'd put in that category, APAC, just like we stand with Israel, double underline, and Israel education is just a little bit softer, or it gives you a wider perspective, but ultimately you also want them to come out with a very particular point of view? Or is the number 3 really open to anything? Are you saying that if somebody listens to you and studies with you and is involved in Israel education, is it okay if they come out and they are antagonistic, they become anti-Zionist, they no longer believe in the current iteration of the state of Israel?
It's a good question as to whether or not it's a binary or a spectrum, but I'll explain the difference, the way I see it and the way we try to do it on Unpacking Israeli History and really all of the short form content on Unpacked in general. It's a term that I created called taking a mikraot gedolot approach to Israel education.
A mikraot gedolot approach to Israeli education. The mikraot gedolot I'm familiar with is the classic chumash that has the Bible, that has all of the classic commentaries from the medieval, even a little bit past that. It has Rashi, it has the Ramban. What would a mikraot gedolot approach be to Israel education?
Once upon a time, I had a friend, not Jewish, Christian, and asked me what it means for the Jews to be the chosen people. So what does it mean that you're the chosen people? So instead of answering the question, like a good Jewish person, I said, I want you to see your Bible and I want you to see my Bible. And took out her Bible, and the Bible was essentially just the words on the page. It was the words of God, or, with the Brit Chadashah, with the New Covenant, with the New Testament, whatever you want to describe that as. It's just the words on the page. I then showed her my Bible, and it was a mikraot gedolot. I said, where are the words of God here? Where are the words of the Bible? She's like, the whole thing. What do you mean? No, I'm like, no. Literally 5 lines. There are 5 lines, the top, right here, the top. And everything else. What does Moshe's sin look like? What is the relationship between angels and mankind? Any question you could possibly ask. It's Rashi versus Rashbam, Ibn Ezra versus Ramban, Sforno versus Chizkuni.
The commentators are fighting this out.
They're fighting it out. And yes, there's some common ground, and for sure there's common ground. But the whole excitement and enthusiasm about studying Tanakh is to see the debate emerge and the implications. What we need to do in Israel education, what we're trying to do, is the same exact thing, but with Israel. Imagine a moment in history happens. Call it 1948, call it the War of Independence. If I say phrases like, Der Yassin, or Kfar Qasem, or Kibbutz, or any moment, difficult moment in Israeli history, and now we're just focusing on difficult moments of Israeli history, but I'll get to a whole other aspect, which is Zionism, hopefully in a bit. But imagine if we took a mikro-gdolot approach, and we said on each of these moments, what we're going to do is we're going to show you how Martin Gilbert understands it, how Betty Morris understands it, how Francine Klagsbrun understands it, how Anita Shapiro understands it, how Yossi Klein Halevi understands it, how Micha Goodman understands it. And we said to our students, you're smart, you're thoughtful, you're intelligent, you're curious. Engage in the debate. And that's what Israel education looks like. And I take a lot of the approach that I developed, that I wrote my dissertation on.
What was the topic of your dissertation? Tell me immediately.
Okay, right now. Israel education and identity development was the topic.
Fascinating.
What I studied. I'm very interested in terms of how identities are cultivated, how to cultivate a healthy relationship with Judaism, with text, with Jewish identity, with Israel, with peoplehood. And so what really stands out to me is utilizing this incredible tradition that we have in Tanakh education and Talmud education and utilizing it for Israel. We know that Israel matters so much to one's Jewish identity, but what happens is it's so thin, the relationship. It's thin. I don't have a better word for it. It's thin. It's this defensive approach. But what if you were able to explore, to uncover, to excavate, to cultivate, to develop your own worldview on it? What would happen? That's what I'm trying to do. And I'll say one more thing on this.
Yeah.
Because just to take this Tanakh sort of approach, one of my favorite ideas of my educational philosophy emerged from a great thinker. His name is Menachem Leibtag. And he points out that the best education does not come from Piaget or Vygotsky, or even Rav Soloveitchik, but it comes from an Israeli construction site. And an Israeli construction site, because I'm answering your question, at every Israeli construction site, you know what it says?
What?
Sakana kan bonim. Danger. We're building here. When you're building something, there is some danger to view our young people as automatons and to think, and you know this from your podcast.
Oh, yes.
To think that if you just tell them the truth, here are the facts. The truth is ... Let's see how everyone is going to react to that. So, sakana kan boni means danger. We're building here. If you're going to be building, if you're going to be cultivating someone's identity, if you're going to be exploring, it's dangerous. But there's a second perush, a second interpretation of that Israeli construction site, which is that in a place of danger, makom sakana, in the place of danger, kan bonim. That's where you build. That's where identity can actually be formed.
Ooh, that's beautiful.
That's my perush on Menachem Leibtag's analysis of an Israeli construction site.
It really does resonate. I mean, you know the work that we're doing, and it's going to lead to my obvious follow-up question. I love the notion of sakana, kan bonim. There's danger. We are building here, and we are building in the place of danger. The analogy that I've used many times on 1840 is a car that is spinning out of control. You don't try to spin away from the disaster. You turn into it, and that allows you to regain control of the car.
That's good.
It is in the place of danger, in the place of friction, that we need to build most. And we've been doing this on other topics of Jewish theology and Jewish life and Jewish practice. I am woefully ignorant, and almost deliberately so, about Israel. But I know enough about developing content, and I know enough about the Mikros Gedolos Chumash to ask the obvious question. If you open up a Mikros Gedolos Chumash, there are some commentaries that are not in there, that have not made their way in there. And there is kind of a canonization process of who is considered to be an authentic voice. I am curious for you, how do you determine which voices are allowed to be on the page? And I'm not asking from unpacked policy. I'm asking you as an educator. I'm asking you as a pedagogue. It is criticism that I have gotten, and very often the criticism is 100% right. David, that was an idea, that was a voice you should not have included. And I often find myself not just pushing back, but accepting the criticism. Maybe I should not have voiced that. So I'm curious for you, are there specific voices that you do not feel comfortable including? Are there voices that you have included in educational programming and have gotten pushback for? And how do you conceptualize the boundaries of what to include on your page of commentaries?
The great and age-old question about what is is in, what is out, what is allowed, what is not allowed. So the way I think about it is I want to generalize first, if that's okay, and then go to the specifics.
Sure.
There's a difference, and I heard this from President Richard Joel once, maybe a decade ago. There's a difference between pluralism and relativism. And the idea of pluralism is to say that I'm right about what I think and you're wrong about what you think, but the two of us can sit at the table and have a conversation together. Whereas relativism says I'm right about what I think and you're right about what you think, and there's no such thing as the absolute truth on anything. So I take not a relativistic approach in Richard Joel's understanding, but an educationally pluralistic approach, which is saying that if we're going to have a complete understanding of any given topic, we have to be able to see different ways to view it. The Rashomon effect.
Explain the Rashomon effect just in 60 seconds.
The Rashomon effect is when you look at an elephant, let's say.
For blind people.
Yeah, and you see the trunk or you see the legs and you think it's something as a result
or
of...
tusk.
Or tusk, yeah. Thank you. I'm not so good at elephant body parts. It's not my strength. But you think it's one thing as a result of it, but you put the whole thing together and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I understand. If I put these pieces together, I see the tapestry. I see that it's actually something beautiful. I see a broader understanding of it. So when doing Israel education, if I'm doing a story on, let's say, the Munich massacre, or I'm doing a story on the Altalena, and I want young people to understand the story of the Altalena, would it make sense to merely share the descendants of Menachem Begin's approach and to show this through the prism exclusively as the heroic moment of Menachem Begin? Or
can you just, again, you're referencing a lot of events.
Okay.
Assume you're talking to an absolute ignoramus about Israeli history.
Okay.
The Altalena was a ship. Yeah. Why is that significant?
So the Altalena is probably, I would argue, one of the 5 most significant moments in Jewish history of the last 1,500, 1,800 years. Don't ask me to say the other 4.
I was about to ask you, and I will absolutely ask you later on. You can't talk to somebody who literally wrote a book called Top 5. It was a humor book, but I am going to be asking for your top 5 list, so you can try to gather that in the back of your head. We'll come back to it, but just tell us the basic facts, and then you'll use the example.
So in June 1948, right after Israel established itself as a Jewish state, there was a question mark. Would Israel actually be able to exist? And it's a question, by the way, that some pundits are asking now in 2023 with everything going on with the judicial reforms, which we will not get into right now, hopefully, because that will take a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
That's too in the weeds. But the Altalena was a month in. You have to remember, there were multiple Jewish militias. There was the Irgun, there was the Haganah, there was the Lehi. And how do you actually form a state? If you have multiple armies, are you going to be able to have a state? Well, that was the question Israel had to deal with. And that was a question that the State Department was unsure Israel would be able to deal with and figure out. And within a month of Israel declaring statehood and all these Arab countries around Israel declaring war and trying to annihilate Israel, there was a ship, Altalena, which actually is Italian for seesaw. And that's just a fun, weird, random fact.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you got it. There was shipments of ammunition that Menachem Begin was on that ship, and David Ben-Gurion didn't want it to dock, and for a whole host of reasons. Ben-Gurion and Rabin, at the time, who was a young commander, shot on the Altalena. Jews were shooting other Jews, if you could imagine this. Jews shooting other Jews.
So obviously this is a controversial moment in Israeli history.
Tremendous.
Where Jews are attacking each other. We'll talk about some of the other significant moments. And there are probably different approaches for how to process, unpack a incident like this, correct?
Exactly, David. And Menachem Begin chose not to shoot back, and he basically said, never milchemet achim, that we will never have a civil war. And the reason it's so significant is because he had a huge following, Menachem Begin. And he could have, and this is one of the arguments, he could have fought Ben-Gurion and said, no, the state that you're declaring is not the type of state I want. I have my own people. I have my own political system. I have my own army. And Ben-Gurion, had this moment where he actually shot, the Haganah shot other Jews, and Begin held back. And that's, a huge story in modern Jewish history, because I think, frankly, if Begin shot back, I'm not sure there would be a Jewish state.
But come back to the original question.
Yeah.
I had asked you about approaches and commentaries that you don't feel comfortable, or commentaries that you've shared and gotten a tremendous amount of pushback, either a commentary or an incident. You were talking about the Rashomon effect. How do you conceptualize what's in, what's out? And have you ever either made a mistake or put something in that people were like, this cannot be taught?
Yeah. So definitely, in every institution, I'm not just, it sounds like a political statement, every institution should decide its own boundaries. But it's very true. Every community should decide that. Listen, curiosity is in some ways the original sin. Because what curiosity does for any community is it opens one up to any possible interest, to any possible intrigue, to something beyond what my community is saying. And so every community is going to say, this is in and this is out. Have I made mistakes? Absolutely, I've made mistakes. Without a doubt, I've made mistakes. I made mistakes in adult education. So I want to say it's not necessarily about how young they are, though that is certainly part of it. There's a way to build what's called a mature approach to Zionism, as opposed to maturing people out of Zionism. We want them to have a mature engagement with Zionism. But if there's an audience that doesn't have the background necessary to understand a certain topic, I don't think that we should be teaching them if the goal of the community is fidelity to the Orthodox Jewish world or fidelity to the state of Israel in an unquestioned sort of way, then of course that community has a right to make its decisions about what's in and what's out. And I can't possibly tell anyone what that is. I don't know each and every community, but what I'm trying to basically argue for is to, regardless what your community's boundaries are, to open it up a little bit more. Because in a world of Google and TikTok, where people are searching content and their TikTok is finding you, finding the young person, what they're able to see, what young Jewish people are able to see is just so different of it than what you and I, when I was at Beth Tfilah and you were at Ner Yisrael, what the two of us were seeing. You know, even beyond, 17-year-old girls at Mama Leah's, there were so many other people. There's so many other things.
That's a deep cut Baltimore reference. That's a pretty deep cut.
But there are so many things that we did not see and that everyone is able to now see. And so are there lines? Of course, but Ner Yisrael's lines are going to look different. I'm using that as a reference point than Beth Tfilah's lines. And every organization and institution has a right to say, here's what's in and here's what's out.
Could you take me through something that you shared related to Israel education that people said, you know what, maybe it's best if we didn't talk about this. Maybe it's best if that perspective wasn't aired. And I'm curious because I don't know the ins and outs of Israeli thought and even Israeli history with such an intense grasp that I would even know where the red lines are. I'm curious what evokes that type of controversy. Where are the lines that the Israel education community are grappling with?
The reason I'm actually struggling to answer this question, and it's a phenomenal question, is because I think that 15 years ago, this question would have been asked more and more, but I actually have a list of, I just spoke at this conference in Chicago called the iCenter Conference.
Sure.
It's so interesting because a lot of people don't know about it. This 2-3 day conference was about Israel education. It had 120 Israel educators in the room talking about the challenges of Israel education. And I'm just going to read to you very quickly what their challenges were. Ready? Very quickly.
Yeah, let's go.
Number 1, addressing sensationalized, dramatized, personalized, decontextualized, that sounds like a hip hop song, media influence. Number 2, connecting, understanding why young people should care about what happens in Israel. Number 3, how to make sure that people don't get too emotional about it. Number 4, acknowledging nuance and complexity without getting stuck in it. Number 5, the emotional connections and attachments to the land of Israel. Number 6, providing context. Number 7, getting people to show up in the first place to actually care about Israel, which often doesn't happen. Number 8, allowing criticism while maintaining a positive bond with Israel. Number 9, laying the foundation before diving into current events in Israel. Number 10, how to teach about Israel to different ages. I have no idea how to do that. Number 11, remaining apolitical for the sake of building meaning and constructive conversations for all. Number 12, how to deal with predetermined biases of the audience. Number 13, being honest about Israel's faults and mistakes, the social racism that exists in Israel, unfair policies towards Arabs. Number 14, the occupation, and this is a note, they did not put the occupation in quotation marks. Number 15, misinformation, breaking down myths. Number 16, how do you deal with student knowledge to build upon? Number 17, how do you tiptoe around the sensitivities of parents and funders and philanthropists about what we're doing and don't really understand what we're doing? And number 18, how and why should we be teaching about Israel in the first place? And so these are the questions that I dealt with.
What a phenomenal list. I'll be honest, listening to most things on that list gives me a great deal of confidence with the non-Zionist approach I was raised with. Because from first grade to, I would say, maybe in the high school was the first time we had a formal Yom HaTzmaut celebration, but I was deeply connected to, again, I'm using these words deliberately, to Eretz Yisroel, to kind of that familial connection to Israel. So the foundation was so immutable that, like, there's only a limited amount of, and I admit this to myself, like, there's only so much that my relationship to the state of Israel can erode because it wasn't founded founded upon the state of Israel. It was founded upon the state of Israel as an iteration of Eretz Yisrael, of something that we've been davening for so many years. And this is a permutation that we have that, I guess, through this tempered non-Zionist lens, we're still deeply connected to everything going on there. But it doesn't begin with a political connection. It doesn't begin with, wow, love Israel because it's the startup nation, because they made the microchip in your cell phone and all the emails that my Zadie used to forward to me, forward. Did you know that Israel, and fill in the blank?
Yeah.
It was very visceral, and I grew up with it. Dare I say, the model of the yeshiva community, I'm not talking about the anti-Zionist that exists in some parts, but the non-Zionist yeshiva community, they have some things right. They have some things right, in my opinion, which is building a visceral connection to Eretz Yisrael and to Amcha Yisrael.
That's great, and that's wonderful, but that's not what Zionism is about. The whole purpose of Zionism was to change the existential condition of the Jew. That was the whole purpose of Zionism. And that's, by the way, why I deeply understand anti-Zionism much more than I understand non-Zionism. And within Zionism, actually, there were three major reasons why Zionism was created. If you look at the different great philosophers, basically comes down to three different reasons why Zionism needs to exist.
Noam, I just want to say I love your lists. Okay. I love that you have lists for everything.
Because I think
you're speaking my language right now.
I'm sorry. I think in terms of lists, it helps my brain. I've realized.
What do you apologize for? I wrote a book. Again, go out and buy it. It's a humor book, but I think in lists.
I really
Top
do.
5 lists of Jewish character and characters. Yeah, this is what it's about. So tell me, what are the three major justifications for Zionism?
Yeah, there were three major ways. Like, why should Zionism exist in the first place? Why abrogate from the past in order to create something new? Why deal with all of this? So there's three different reasons. And you can understand people's sensitivities. And by the way, Zionism is part of Israel education. It's not just dealing with the tough subjects. But Zionism itself, and I want people to understand this, it's a common platform. It's not an exclusive ideology. So within Zionism, just like there are great debates between great religious Zionist thinkers, there are great debates within great secular Zionist thinkers. Within this great secular Zionist thinkers, there are three different reasons. Number one is we need Zionism. We need a Jewish state in order to be like everyone else. Basically, the reason that anti-Semitism exists, as it were, is because the Jewish people, this was the thinking, the Jewish people are ghosts in other people's lands. And when you're a ghost in other people's lands, not tethered to any one place, that's the reason why anti-Semitism exists. And if you like a good Yesod HaMachloket, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners...
The foundational dispute. We translated this space.
Okay, great.
I don't know what kind of hokey-pokey stuff you guys do in Unpack, but we translate on the 1840 podcast.
Okay, so one of the foundations to the disputes, the great foundational disputes existed, and it's not like they got in a room and disputed this, but between Herzl and Jabotinsky. And what Herzl was saying was that he believed that the creation of a Jewish state would essentially end anti-Semitism. That's the verb to think about. Or another verb would be to cure the world of anti-Semitism. And his disciple, Jabotinsky, said, no, it's not going to end anti-Semitism. It's going to protect against anti-Semitism. Now, fast forward 100 years, who's right, Herzl or Jabotinsky? And the answer is clearly Jabotinsky.
Or neither, but
neither, okay.
Yeah,
or neither, well said.
Call me crazy.
Well said. But the reason it needs to exist is because we want to be like everyone else. And this is an example, if you want to understand, if you want to create typologies, we like lists. So the reason the Munich Massacre in 1972 is so difficult, and the Munich Massacre, I will do an explanatory comma, was 51 years ago. 11, I think, Israelis were killed at the Munich Olympics in 1972.
It takes place in Germany, so it's a bad look.
Yes.
There's a phenomenal documentary on it that I'm sure people should watch. I found it absolutely riveting and a really painful moment for the world, frankly. The show must go on, as they said.
Exactly. We also have a podcast on the Munich Massacre. The reason it's so difficult is because just think about the purpose of Zionism. It's to be like everyone else. Is there any better example of just being like everyone else, having a seat at the table than the Olympics? Or another example, when there's so many UN resolutions against Israel, and it's nonstop. The Zionism that's born out of this need to be like everyone else, to want, it's like almost biblical in terms of Samuel, like to have a king like everyone else, to be like everyone else. Can't we just be like everyone else? So that was one purpose of Zionism.
And it kind of showed us that maybe the answer is no, because we were at the table at the Olympics and
exactly. We feel like a Jew amongst the nations at that point.
Yeah, okay. What's number 2 and 3?
Number 2 is the second reason that Zionism should exist, to create, is to be not normal, but to be exceptional. And this idea, I think, comes from Tal Becker, another thinker on this topic, but to be unique, to be different. And that's the whole tikkun olam aspect of Israel. When Golda Meir, as part of her foreign ministry, would go to Africa to say, just like we're building up the Jewish people's self-determination, let's make life better for Africans as well. Or, like when Israel goes to Turkey or tries to go to Syria or goes to Nepal or goes to Haiti, why does it do that? Beyond the PR, I choose not to be cynical, and I believe as Zionism's foundation, to understand Zionism, it is actually part of the Jewish state. The whole purpose of it was not just to be normal, but to be exceptional. So that's another reason for Zionism. Why have another state? Well, to do something big, to accomplish something special. And that's the whole idea of number 2. And the third reason is, I think, the most common reason, and that is provide an oasis from anti-Semitism that does exist, to provide that refuge, to provide a home that just has to exist, to make sure that when everyone's kicking you out, when everyone's oppressing you, when everyone is persecuting you, whether it's genocide or more microaggressions, if I can say that, then there's a place for you. That's called the Jewish state. And those are the 3 different reasons for Zionism.
For secular Zionism.
Yeah, those are 3 different reasons for secular
Zionism. I'll be real with you. Yeah. None of those 3 have anything to do with my relationship with Eretz Yisrael or the state of Israel. Not nothing, but it's not the foundational reason. They all feel very defensive to me. They're not proactive in Amcha Yisrael, and dare I say something a little bit more messianic, a little bit more tasting a little bit of redemption in this world, of returning to our homeland.
Yes.
The end of Jewish history almost.
Yeah, that only became popular in the mid-60s, early 70s. Religious Zionism, Mizrahi Zionism, actually not until after the Six-Day War was it very popular amongst religious Zionists. Reb Soloveitchik, because I know that you're aware, maybe your listeners as well, and even like Rabbi Lamb, I don't think that you would put them in the category of Messianic Zionists.
No, absolutely not. Rabbi Lamb had a famous dispute with Rabbi Schubert Spiro in the pages of Shema Journal, where he was quite clear that Zionism should be denuded of its messianic elements.
Yeah.
I have a hard time with that because of the familial relationship to Israel. I find both the danger and the volatility of Israel, this sakana kan bonim, the danger, it feels a little bit messianic to me, and I'm always moved by the writings of Rav Kook and even Gershom Scholem and the way Scholem looked at the danger of Hebrew language. He has a famous letter where he was worried that we're repurposing in modern Hebrew these very loaded terms, chashmal, merkava. Yeah. We're taking these mystical terms and using them for Israeli. We're reshaping the Jewish consciousness as we speak. Yep. That's the sakana element. That's the danger of all of this. I love these 3 approaches. I want to take this conversation in a different direction, and I want to talk about the contemporary state of anti-Zionism among Jews.
Okay.
And I am wondering if you have any listeners or you have ever had an incident where an anti-Zionist began listening to you and you have been able to change minds. How do you change minds? How do you reach somebody? My personal theory is that unless you have been raised with that familial instinctive, the narrative that stretches not from 1948, but stretches to 70 CE, to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, to God's promise to Avraham of taking him, Lech lecha me'artzecha el ha'aretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. Unless you have that really deep knowledge, it's very hard to win arguments based on the political or philosophical merits. Am I wrong? Do you see that if we marshal better arguments, no one is lost? You could convince an anti-Zionist about the importance of Israel. I feel like those arguments need to be instilled not as arguments, but as instinctive components of your Jewish identity. But let's say that somebody didn't grow up in such a home and they don't have those deep roots. It's very thinly built. Can you convince an anti-Zionist of the importance or the beauty or the majesty or at the very least the right of the state of Israel?
I'm not the best at convincing or persuasion. I'm not the best debater in the world. What I like to think of myself as, and what I try to do with our team at Unpacked, is actually a little bit different than that. I mean, I'm not great at it. Other people are great at it. But I also think that it just doesn't work. Adam Grant, who's a Rebbe of mine and probably someone that you've read on Shabbat and tweeted about afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah. He says that a common problem in persuasion is that what doesn't sway us makes our beliefs stronger. And when you're engaging in the persuasion and you're thinking about how to convince, I don't find that particularly compelling. Anyone that I find that's trying to convince me of something, persuade me on something, my guard is up. I'm less interested. I'm less intrigued. A great example, by the way, is Al Gore's film from like 20 years ago about climate change.
An Inconvenient Truth.
Which simply made other people who already disagree with him stronger. So it has this almost ironic effect. It has this deleterious effect if you're trying to persuade. So I do think if you're trying to educate and you're trying to cultivate and you're trying to move somebody and allow them to see something slightly differently, if they're open to it and asking if they're open to it, then absolutely it moves people. On the right, on the left, religious, secular, absolutely. But you have to have their permission first. You gotta have their permission first. And their permission looks at it in certain ways. It could be, I'm searching for this on the internet. If I'm searching for this on the internet, I want to learn something new as a result of it. I'm searching for this on Spotify. That means I want to learn something new. I'm giving you permission to engage with me. In a classroom, it's the same sort of thing. I have no interest in trying to convince or persuade anyone of anything if they tell me that they have no interest in being persuaded. From any context, it simply doesn't work.
We share such similar philosophies with this, but I'm curious proactively. I mean, imagine the following. Somebody who's growing up now, they are turning, let's say, 22, 23 now. Their relationship to Israel, maybe they went on a birthright trip, maybe they went with their high school class in 12th grade, and they are looking at news reports, maybe not in depth, and Israel seems to be, in their eyes, been co-opted by right-wing politically, by right-wing religious actors, and they look and say, Israel is no longer for me. This doesn't reflect who I am. When I go to Israel, I don't feel like my lifestyle is reflected in here. I don't think that kid is coming to you.
Yeah, they are.
So they are coming to you and saying, help me.
That's not anti-Israel, David. That's not anti-Israel.
What is that?
That's someone who has a difficulty with the political system in Israel right now. You know, from the beginning, you mentioned this Zionism, this approach is very political. I actually think that it's dafka not political.
Specifically, yeah.
My goal in connecting people to Israel and connecting people to Israelis is not to have them connect to the Israeli government. I don't care about connecting anyone to anyone's government. That is superficial, thin, myopic at best. The goal is to connect Jews to Israelis, to connect American Jewry to Israeli Jewry, to connect Americans to their history. I deeply believe in connecting people to Zionism, which is beyond those three things. Like I was going to say this earlier, Zionism, I would argue, allows you to wear a kippah on the street right now. Zionism is what restored dignity to the Jewish people.
I'm going to be honest, I'm totally not convinced by that. I appreciate it, and it's not at all what Zionism does for me on a personal level.
Okay, fair enough. But I think that for a lot of Jews, it has. It allows them to wear their Magen David out. It allows them to feel proud of something.
It gives them a sense of pride.
It gives them a sense of pride,
yes.
Exactly. But I tell people all the time that you don't have to agree with the Israeli government. Because imagine it's like this. Imagine you're on the right, okay? And in the mid-90s, it's been a while, right? But in the mid-90s, the Israeli government was more towards the left. Does that mean if you don't connect with the Israeli government, you don't connect with Israel? No, of course you could connect with Israel. You don't agree with their policies. But that's okay. You're allowed to disagree with policies. You know who disagrees with Israeli policies? Israelis. Israelis disagree with Israeli policies. So I think what's happened in America specifically is we've almost asked young people to sit on the sidelines and to say, hey, listen, your job is to cheer for Israel and to support Israel and to just make sure that that happens. I think that that has an unintended consequence of not giving people the authority and handing them the ball to dribble and saying to them, hey, build, hey, cultivate, hey, be part of. So I have no issue with people disagreeing with the Israeli government. I think they should learn why they disagree with the Israeli government. If they're so passionate about the Israeli government, they should learn about it more and more and understand the history of it. But I don't view that as antagonistic towards Israel. And I think educationally, my goal really is to allow people to see the wide contours of dispute that exists within Israeli society and that exists within the Knesset and bring that to your table. That is part of the Zionist project.
I really genuinely love just the way you're describing your educational approach. If somebody were to come to you, and you had mentioned this list earlier, the 5 most significant events in the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, you could give me 2 different lists. I actually would prefer the list of what are the 5 events that we need to tiptoe around or that require the largest Mikraos Gedolos page, that requires the most commentary. What are the events that are the most complicated to explain and need the most educational context. What are we avoiding? What are the 5 conversations that are the hardest to really confront and develop?
I'll divide them up into 2 categories. One Zionism, one Israel history, and military being part of that. I don't know if you want me to give you the 5 most important events in Zionist Israeli history or the 5 most difficult moments.
Let's do both. Let's start with the most significant, and then let's do the 5 most controversial, most difficult.
Okay.
Even for my own, frankly, just like a framework of understanding what I should be learning.
Okay. The first event that I think everyone should learn about is Kishinev, specifically Kishinev. A listener who's maybe Jewish, I'm not sure. He leads a secular non-denominational school, reached out to me, told me that learning about Kishinev, quote, changed his life.
What's a line? Kishinev is a place, is a town?
Yeah, Kishinev is a city. It's actually in, I think, modern-day Ukraine, which is wild or right around there. And the way I view it is it was Auschwitz before Auschwitz. Like, before there was a thing called Auschwitz, this is what changed the Jewish world and the Zionist world and the world at large to be like, holy Lord, there needs to be a Jewish state. Like, there needs to be Jewish self-determination. The second event we already mentioned is the Altalena. I think that to understand modern Israeli history, you need to understand the Altalena. We didn't even talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict yet, but one of the reasons that I think that the Palestinian leaders aren't nearly as strong as Israeli leaders is because they haven't had their Altalena moment yet.
That's so interesting. Where the differing factions literally came to butt heads and they were forced to say, we need to stick together or we're going to fall apart. That is very interesting. I appreciate that point a lot. So number 1 is Kishinev. Number 2 is the Altalena. Give me your other 3 in your top 5 most significant events in Israeli history.
Number 3 is, without a doubt, the 1948 War of Independence. I don't need to say more about that, but there's so much that went into behind the scenes, the creation of this Jewish state, the creation of the Declaration of Independence, the lack of a constitution, which 75 years later we're seeing the reverberations of that consequential indecision or lack of decision or decision. And that's gigantic. Number 4 is the Yom Kippur War. The reason the Yom Kippur War stands out to me as such a critical moment, and we're going to have 50 years since the Yom Kippur War coming up. It's this moment where, you and I probably learned about it in one way, which is, Israel's never lost a war, that whole thing.
Sure.
But if you study the history of the Yom Kippur War, it totally changed Israeli society. It scared the heck out of everyone. For 6 years, Israel had what's called in Hebrew, it's not Hebrew, but it's called in Hebrew, the conceptia, which means that they had this almost, I want to say, I hate to say this about my Jewish brothers and sisters, but a kochi ve'otzim yadi asali techayel hazeh moment, which means that it's my strength and my might that brought me to this moment. They thought they were invincible. Well, they saw just how vincible, definitely not a word, that they were. And that was a tremendously important moment. And the last one that I will say, there's so many others, but a moment of just absolute exquisite celebration is the story of Operation Thunderbolt, the story of Entebbe that many of us saw in summer camp with that incredible music.
Sure.
That should be in my pregame mix without a doubt. But it's this moment where what I was describing earlier, to change the existential condition of the Jew, to restore the dignity to the Jewish people. That moment, 1976, the bicentennial of the American Revolution, it happened July 4th. And even more than the 6-Day War, more is too strong, Noam, relax. But the 6-Day War is tremendous, obviously. But what this did was, it showed the world, the Jewish people, it's crazy. The Jewish people, the Jewish state said, we're going to take matters into our own hands and we're going to fly thousands of miles and do this unbelievable event, which is to save Jewish people. And it happened and it worked with, a few really important tragic moments along the way. America tried to do this with Iran a few years later and it failed. Israel it's this unbelievable romantic moment that I think every young Jewish person should know about.
I want to go through your top 5 again, just so people know it. It was fantastic.
Okay.
You put Kishinev, you put Altalena, you put War of Independence, you put Yom Kippur War, and you put Operation Thunderbolt. I have no doubt that there are people who are going to write either me or you letters that Operation Thunderbolt beat out 67. Just be prepared for that.
Okay.
I might write you a letter after we hang up right now.
I might write myself a letter.
Yeah, that image of Rabbi Goren blowing shofar at the Kotel and being reunited with the Kotel. Obviously, it's indicative of my relationship to Israel, and I think you're telling not a less personal story, but a different story about Israel's standing in the world and how that came to be.
Yeah.
And the stories that I think animate me most, that's why I want to hear your list so badly. My stories are like deeply personal, they're deeply religious in a lot of ways, and that's probably the only qualm that I have. I never even heard of Kishinev, and I will definitely look it up afterwards, but that is not the only top 5 that I wanted to hear.
No.
The real top 5 that I want to hear, especially from an Israel educator, especially for people who are trying to understand, where is all of the animus coming from? Like, why do they hate us so much? Or the famous meme that is so often used in relationship to Israel. I forgot what show it's from. Are We the Baddies? There's this famous show where you see 2 Nazis who are together in the bunker and they're looking at their uniform, which has skulls and all of this evil, scary imagery. And they look at one another and they say, are we the baddies? Like, are we the bad ones? And very often that's used as a critique on Israel. Like, we're so convinced that Israel's in the right. I am so convinced. I don't think I could be persuaded otherwise. So, I'm obviously not the audience for this, but what are the 5 incidents that cause the most controversy or that are the most difficult to transmit? Because it does make people question, or they are used in order to tear down Israel's right to exist or Israel's right to any sense of moral, not just superiority, that's not what we're aiming for, but moral decency.
So you said you're not interested in being persuaded, so maybe on this front, but maybe your listeners will be. I'll tell you a quick story.
Are you going to give me the list?
Okay,
I don't want you to weasel out of this list.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a list.
But tell me a quick story
first.
Tell
you a quick story to give context to this. 50 years after the Munich massacre, which we just spoke about, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA, Palestinian Authority, was in Munich, was in Germany, or Berlin, wherever he was in Germany. And he was on the soil. He was on the soil where these 11 Israelis were massacred. And he was asked to reflect on that moment 50 years later. And he says, you want me to reflect on this? Really? Do you know what Israel has done to us? He says, 50 Holocausts they've committed. 50 Holocausts. So now my heart's thumping. Anyone who watches this is just getting angry. Blood's boiling, right? I think. And then he starts to say, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. And he says, Kfar Qasem, Kibbeh, Deir Yassin. So I show this clip to everyone. And I did this in Australia, in Sydney. I said to everyone, all the students, hundreds of students, how did you feel when you heard Mahmoud Abbas say this? Everyone screams, disgusting, awful, anti-Semitic, terrible. And I'm like, yeah, I agree, by the way. And so your listeners, I agree. Terrible, awful. But then I asked a different question. Raise your hand now, 200 of you. Raise your hand now if you could tell me what happened at Deir Yassin. Raise your hand if you could tell me what happened at Kfar Qasem. Raise your hand if you could tell me what happened at Kibbeh. And the point is, nobody was able to. And what I struggle with, and when I'm trying to engage with my education, is there's something called psychologically the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is when people have overconfidence and undercompetence. They're so confident about what they think and what they feel, but they're not actually competent. And David, you are such a proud, powerful, and brilliant Jew. Like really one of the smartest.
That means so much to me.
When I shared the podcast that you were on with me on happiness, and I shared it with people, the only feedback I got was that guy is really smart. That guy is brilliant.
That's very kind.
I'm like, I know, and it's true. So you have this connection to Yiddishkeit. You have this fluency that exists. You have that all. So you don't necessarily need to know what happened. Maybe I could argue against it, but maybe not. But most people who don't have that, and they're going to college campuses, they're going to the workplace, put aside college campuses, and they are now in the role of the Jew. They now need to understand and talk about Israeli history as though they're like some scholar, even though they're not. They didn't ask for that role, but they are in that role. They got to know these moments. And these moments, like anything sophisticated, and if you're in the broader Orthodox world, the modern Orthodox world, very good at understanding multiple perspectives. We're the only, whomever, the only community that even has heard of the word dialectic. Like, we're able to deal with contradictory and difficult and dichotomous ways of thinking about things. But we put that aside very often when learning about Israel. And I think that is a problem, because it's not that you should be a critical thinker except about this one thing. That will never happen. So the moments that I have within that context.
Now we're going to the top 5.
Now the top
and
5.
I'm not pushing back, and I don't want to engage. So much of our conversation has been struggling with whether or not I even agree with this. Meaning, is maybe the approach that I took, and very often, in my role in NCSY, or, my role more as an educator to teens, I struggle with this because it's hard. The foundations and the donors want to hear robust Israel education. They're desperate for it. And I'm always nervous, is this the right path? And and you made a good case for why maybe it's very specific to me, but I'm really, really struggle with this, and I'm not sure that I'm right. I'm not sure that the other approach is right. I know that you can't feel connected to Eretz Yisrael just through a political lens. That much I know.
We're on the exact,
and we're in agreement on that.
More. I could not agree with you more on that.
But how to build that depth and the order with which to build that depth is something that I often struggle with. But I first want to hear this list because I really appreciate these lists, and you happen to be great at making lists. So let's hear the top 5 most controversial events related to Israeli history.
Here's what I got for you. Number 1 is Der Yassin, April 1948. It's one of the reasons that people who, and I don't like this term frankly, but the pro-Palestinian world will turn to, and they will say Israel was born in sin. That because of Der Yassin, Israel is born in sin. Well, what happened there? Big question mark. I'm not going to go into the history of it. Listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
Number 2 is, I would say, the 6-Day War.
Wow. I didn't expect to see that on the list.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I mean by that. Not the 6-Day War itself, but the consequence of the 6-Day War. For people who are in this sympathizing with Palestinian camp, there's 2 different terms. There's the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. That refers to the dispossession as they see it of the Palestinian people in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, the Jewish state. That's called the Nakba. And then there's another word that people don't know, but it's called the Naksa, which means the setback. 19 years after the formation of the Jewish state in 1948 was what they call the Naksa, the setback. And the setback was when Israel tripled in size. It gained the Golan, it gained Judea and Samaria, which people call the West Bank, it gained the Sinai, and again Gaza. It tremendously changed everything. Israel all of a sudden was not this little shepsula, this little nothing, this little runt. All of a sudden Israel, especially with the development of Dimona over the years, meaning the nuclear plant, and tripling in size, it just became strong. And then it had to deal with this massive question. Because remember, not until 1967 did it have to deal with this question. How do you deal with millions of Palestinians living under your dominion, under your control? How do you deal with that question? That's a really important question to deal with. And people have to think about how to deal with that question. Again, I'm not giving any answers to that, but that is a question that you have to think through. That 5 minutes away from Jerusalem is Ramallah, right?
It changed the demographics of Israel itself. Aside from growing, we were now the sovereign state. Israel was now the sovereign state over a much larger Palestinian population.
Correct.
And this is where a lot of the green lines come in from this,
exactly.
Right? And that's from 67.
When people talk about the word occupation, they mean 3 different things typically. It could mean of the land that was gained in 67. It could mean all of 1948. And if it means 1967...
Wait, you said 3 things. I only heard 2 things.
The third thing is that it's not that the land is occupied. This is an idea from Yossi Klein HaLevi, which was a total reframing of it. The land is Jewish land, says Yossi Klein HaLevi. It's Jewish ancestral, it's land. It's the Jewish people's land. So to call any land occupied is inaccurate. But he says, well, the land isn't occupied, and you can never say that. The people are occupied. The Palestinian people are occupied. So those are 3 different ways that people use the term occupation.
For our listeners, what you just heard was a list within a list. So this is like when I was in elementary school, it was always exciting when the Rebbe would tell a story, and then in the middle of the story, some Hasidic Rebbe would tell another story. The whole class would be like, oh my gosh, story in a story, story in a story. It's very exciting. So we're in the middle of a list of top 5 most controversial events related to Israeli history. We did Der Yassin, we did 67. We took a brief detour of 3 versions of occupation, whether it is the occupation of 48, of 67, or the Yossi Klein HaLevi, does occupation refer to occupation of the people? Let's hear the rest of the list, 3, 4, and 5.
Okay. Number 3 is Zionism is racism, which was, I know, obviously, I don't think it's racism, but this was a UN resolution 3379. And that was so important to understanding, again, how the Jewish community in Israel really felt just incredibly sidelined and disrespected and delegitimized and demonized. So you have to understand what went into that, and then subsequently what the Israeli government did in order to respond to it. And it's a fascinating story.
And this is where a lot of like the apartheid accusations come in response to this.
Exactly.
That the uniquely Jewish character of the state of Israel, by definition, must be racist. It's a racial policy, which obviously doesn't sit well among Jews or non-Jews. And understanding, the context of UN Resolution 3379, that's number 3 on the list.
And it was repealed in the early 90s. Number 4, I would say, is a totally different way to view this. Not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict issue, but Jew versus Jew. And that's the story of the Israeli Black Panthers. People don't know the story of the Pantarim HaShorim, the Israeli Black Panthers. Panthers that modeled themselves after the American Black Panthers. And that's just a story that no one knows about. I actually just got a Haggadah called the Israeli Black Panther Haggadah because I'm that much of a nerd that such a concept exists. I had to get it and read it. But they're a group of Mizrahim, of North African Jewry, that felt that they did not have a place in Ashkenazi elite secular Zionism. And the person, by the way, that became their hero was none other than Menachem Begin, who really viewed his job as restoring the unity to the Jewish people. But the story of the Israeli Black Panthers is a story that so few people know about, but I think it's so interesting. And then the last one is just a tragic story. It's the story of Rabin's assassination, of Yigal Amir killing Rabin, assassinating Rabin, and the implications of that, the question marks that emerge from that, from people like Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rav Yehuda Amital, who really just wonder whether or not, we could say that just one bad seed, or whether or not the community is responsible for what took place here. And that's an existential question that educators need to think about, how to incorporate empathy, how to incorporate understanding people with whom you have strong disagreements with, and dealing with, war, and dealing with governments that you have a strong problem with.
I think that's really an excellent list. Again, Deir Yassin was one, the 67 war and really the implications afterwards, UN Resolution 3379, Jew versus Jew, Israeli Black Panthers, that probably signifies something larger than that, and finally Rabin's assassination. I really love your list, and I love how organized you are in the way that you conceptualize and tell the history of Israel. I mean that really sincerely. It happens to be one of my real blind spots. It's pitch black is the ins and outs of Israeli history, Israeli political history. I am woefully undereducated, and I really think I'm going to dedicate more time. I have listened to you before, but I need to listen to a lot more, which really allows me to segue into how we normally wrap up our interviews. I usually call these rapid fire questions. I would like you to spend a drop more time on my first question, because it's really coming from a personal place.
Okay.
I would like to know if you were to recommend books, plural deliberately, because I don't think there's any one book, but the starting point to begin to understand the story of Israeli history, Zionist philosophy. Where did this begin? How do I understand the conflicting sides? Something that really presents to you that Mikroos Gedolos, the commentaries by them side, and processes the most. What are the books that you would recommend somebody who really wants to understand what the state of Israel is all about and continues to grapple with?
I'll share 3 books that are incredibly different from one another. One is called The Ark of a Covenant by Walter Russell Mead. It is incredibly granular in the details that it incorporates in the storytelling of why America supports Israel, the history of the Israeli-American relations, what it's all about, where Zionism comes from. It's brilliant. It's called The Ark of a Covenant. Number 2 is by Micha Goodman. It's in Hebrew. It has an English translation as well, but the Hebrew is called Chazara B'li Tshuva.
What is it in English?
The Wandering Jew.
And what's that book about?
That book is about the different strains of Zionism and how it impacts our thinking today, the different types of secular Zionism, which I have so much more to say about that, and religious Zionism, and how it therefore influences today. And then the third, it's definitely more of a left-wing book, so I want to just clarify that to make sure that everyone knows that, but it's called Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine. It shows the same exact event, but from what's described as an Israeli perspective and a Palestinian perspective. I have some issues with the book, without a doubt, but it gives me a lot of information. That's an example of something that I would not give this book to a 14-year-old. I wouldn't, certainly, it's not my Young Israel bar mitzvah book, but it's a book that might be... presents
really the conflicting narratives related to the founding of the state of Israel. I want to push you because a lot of these books are advanced.
Okay.
Is there a classic book on the history of the state of Israel? Like just an absolute classic? Almost like the 101, the introductory course. Just the basics. Take me from the founding till at least, 67.
I got you. I'll give you 3 options. Option number 1 is Anita Shapira. Her book is called Israel. Number 2 is Danny Gordis' book, Israel, A Concise History. And number 3, and it's a bit of a tome, is also just called Israel History by Martin Gilbert. But the 4th, I would say, this is just one that makes me happy and I love it and I use it all the time.
Let me just say, we need way more creativity in our Israel history book titles. My God. Who are the publishers here? We gotta mix it up a little bit, okay? But what's number four?
Number 4 is just the one that like brings me joy and smiles and stories. Also not the most creatively named book, but such a great one. The Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner. I'm sure you've read that.
Oh, yeah. That was like a staple. I feel like all Jewish dads were sent a copy
Yeah.
at the same time. I saw it in every shul around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an absolute classic. I very much appreciate that. You already have a PhD in Israel education and its relationship to Jewish identity formation. If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical to go back to school and write either a book or another PhD, what do you think the subject and title of that book would be?
The topic would be something to do with polarization and partisanship and democracy and conversation. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but that is one of the areas that I am obsessed with trying to work through and figure out. That political polarization, religious polarization, I find so damaging, and it's so hard for me because I don't identify with it. And it's just hard. And I know that it's not that I'm not passionate about issues. I'm incredibly passionate about issues. One of the issues of being moderate is that a lot of people who are moderates don't have a moderate amount of energy. But I think that moderates can really add things to moderates religiously, moderates politically, and whatever it looks like. And so it's very hard for me because I don't identify with partisan politics. I don't identify with polarization, and I want to increase a lot more empathy in the world. So I would study just polarization amongst different groups and amongst different areas. So that's what I would do.
That's fantastic. It reminds me of the work that I think you may have even been one of the first to introduce him to me, and he is a former guest on 1840, the incredible Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
I'm pronouncing his last name correctly.
I did.
But he's done a lot of research on partisanship.
Yeah.
My last question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
So when I lived in LA, I went to sleep much earlier at like 9:30, 10 p.m. because I had to wake up because half of our team lives in Israel. So I'd have these meetings starting at 4:30 a.m. And now I wake up a bit later. I have the same alarm all the time at 5:45. One of my friends who saw how ridiculous I am sees me set up everything with my coffee right beforehand. One of my worst qualities, I have many, but one of my worst qualities is that I drink low-level coffee. It's really unacceptable, frankly. But even that, I open up the Via first beforehand, before I go to sleep at night. Just to pack it. I have my mug ready to go. But now that I live on the East Coast, I live in Florida, I love sports, and specifically I love NBA and college basketball, and the West Coast times aren't possible. So I, at like 10:30, 11, start watching for like 40 minutes, and then I fall asleep, and then my alarm is at 5:45, and I have my coffee. I have water, and then coffee.
Indulge me for 1 second. I don't usually do this, but it's one question that I forgot to ask you, and I usually like ending on a sleep question. I am just curious for this series, where do you get your current event Israeli news from? Are there specific writers, outlets that you recommend for people who want to understand what's going on in Israel?
I just read everything, and of course Twitter. I'm actually not great on Twitter, but there's someone named Amit Segal it's in Hebrew, but it's an important place to get your news. But what I do, and this is my style when I'm trying to bring to the world, is to read Arutz Sheva, Haaretz, Times of Israel, J-Post, and to see those wide contours of this dispute that exists within Israeli society and within the media, and then to come up with your own perspectives as a result of that interaction. So that's what I do. I just binge all of that. And specifically, there's one really intelligent thinker out there. His name is Michael Koplow. He's the chief policy officer at IPF, Israel Policy Forum, which is a center-left, I would say, organization. Actually, I think he went to MTA, by the way. But he's brilliant. And if you want to just see an understanding of what's going on, that's very political. He's very political. That's his orientation. He's not an educator. He's in that NGO space. But that's a really interesting and important place to turn to.
My dearest friend, Noam Weissman, Dr. Noam Weissman, thank you so much for speaking today with 1840.
David, I am so happy to be here and really, really love the work you do. I want to say one last note, if that's allowed. I was listening to your podcast with Rabbi Kamenetsky. He quoted Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who said, if you give people just enough Gemara, they're going to hate it or something, right?
Yeah, you give them just enough to hate it.
Yeah, so I think that could happen with Israel as well. And if we're going to be engaging in Zionism and Israel education, let's do it right.
I really appreciate that analogy. I appreciate you and all all the work you do and just continued success in everything that you are involved in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David.
What fascinated me so much is that the very questions of Israel education and how do we provide an Israel education, to me, and you heard it in the conversation, were so many of the negotiations that we have on 1840. What is the best way, not just for Israel education, but Yiddishkeit education? Do we just tell over kind of the sanitized story? Maybe begin with the sanitized story. If you heard my voice throughout, what I was almost advocating for is you need that foundation of a relationship, whether it's with Eretz Yisrael or with Yiddishkeit, that is almost beyond reproach. It is that emuna peshuta, that simple faith that we have in our identity and our commitments and who we are as a people. And it's only upon that faith that we're able to build with confidence the nuance and the differences and the questions that emerge, not just with the state of Israel, not just with Jewish history, but with Yiddishkeit, with Judaism, with our lives. And it's so interesting that so many of the political questions that emerge about the way that we transmit the story of Israel are really just a microcosm of the larger questions of how we transmit Jewish identity in the modern age, a question that continues to animate all of the work that we do on 1840. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our dearest friend, Dina Emerson. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You could also donate at 1840.org/donate. And thank you again to our friends at OpenDor Media. You could check out more of their incredible work at OpenDorMedia.org, where their incredible podcasts, Unpacking Jewish History, Unpacking the Israel Story, can be found on any podcast player and, of course, on OpenDorMedia.org. Your support really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.